When Xi Jinping came to power a decade ago, China had just overtaken Japan to become the world's second-largest economy. It has grown at a phenomenal pace since then, with an average annual growth rate of 6.7% since 2012. China has seen one of the fastest sustained expansions for a major economy in history. But there has been a major twist in this success story. The CCP is going through what experts have said, the worst turmoil in more than a decade. With protests all over the country against the zero-COVID policy, this is the first time in Chinese history that the government seems to be kneeling in front of the protesters. But what lies ahead may have adverse effects for the future and may be setting up a big paradigm shift in the global political landscape. But before we step into the video, make sure you press that like and subscribe button so that you stay updated with all of those geopolitical shifts around the globe. Thousands of Chinese citizens in more than 20 cities were out in the streets holding white A4 papers beginning on November 25th, frustrated by lengthy COVID-19 lockdowns, widespread testing, and other restrictions placed on people's movements. It was one of the largest acts of public dissent ever seen in China. But what's even bigger is the demand for resignation from the boss himself, Xi Jinping. It goes without saying that China has been probably the most affected nation by COVID-19. According to reports, China, being host to the virus, was also the worst struck. As was the case throughout the globe, the Chinese government had to impose some strict restrictions known as the zero-COVID policy. People were barred from stepping out of their homes. Even when the virus started to deplete, the restrictions continued. Frustrations with the zero-COVID policy have been rumbling for a while. As the rest of the world returns to something resembling a normal life, China's population is still being subjected to sudden harsh lockdowns of areas ranging from individual shops to entire counties, often over just a few cases. But something happened that would expose the totalitarian ideas of the ruling government and would change the course of history forever. People have detained unknown numbers of protesters, including at least one foreign journalist, and this situation has created fear among the protesters, who are protesting against the draconian policies, holding blank white papers. A modern element of these protests is the pushback against online censorship. China's internet firewall and armies of information moderators is extraordinarily effective, but perhaps has reached the limits of the people's patience. Citizens are playing cat and mouse with censors, finding creative ways to share videos and posts about the protests, express solidarity, or complain about authorities. Now the big question, how are these protests affecting the Chinese government, and what can we expect in the future? Now these protests have immense significance. Let us show you how. Let's not forget how the credibility of Xi Jinping and his government has been affected, and it has resulted in mass protests across the nation. And to compound all of that, China is suffering from a great COVID tsunami, and according to reports, Beijing and Shanghai are reporting overflowing hospitals. Beijing had little choice in making a U-turn in its zero-COVID policy in mid-December when two things became clear. First, it was undermining the already slowing economy by cutting exports and retail sales. Second, and more importantly, it was generating social tensions that had begun to lead to unprecedented protests. Cities like Shanghai saw months of lockdown in 2022. Now, if you take a look at the broader picture, the industrial centers of China are having a serious effect due to the protests, and it is practically shutting down the economy. According to reports, oil plunged, and in December 22, it was hitting a review low. Similarly, the companies reliant on China for their production, such as Apple, are losing ground. Apple went down by 2.6%, which is quite extraordinary considering its lofty standards. When protests get bad, entire cities are shut down, and this is causing problems for the Chinese economy. The mounting political tension has also been difficult to interpret. The protests at first seemed focused on COVID restrictions, but now appear to carry broader demands for political reform. The blank sheets of paper held up by demonstrators in Shanghai, the country's financial hub, have already become iconic symbols of defiance against a government that limits free speech. The fallout in China's property market is a prime example of this rising financial distress. Property was the asset that benefited the most from China's rapid credit expansion over the past decade. China's property sector makes up a third of its economic output. That includes houses, rental and brokering services, industries producing white goods that go into apartments, and construction materials. But China's economy has been slowing. In the last quarter, it grew by just 0.4% compared to the previous year. Some economists don't expect any growth this year. That's largely because of Beijing's zero-COVID strategy. Repeated lockdowns and continued restrictions have affected incomes and, in turn, savings and investments. All in all, the credibility of the sitting government is taking some serious hits, and they're losing their ground at a rapid rate. And with the property market taking the toll of the protests, the situation is affecting the economy at a rapid rate. People under lockdown say they struggle to find food and other basic necessities. Economic growth has slumped, and unemployment has been rising as a side effect of lockdowns. And to compound things up, even the real estate market has slowed down significantly. Now let us not forget that the sheer magnitude of the Chinese economy makes it a critical player in the world commerce. Its booming industry has imported petroleum at an immense scale, making it the largest importer of petroleum. Delays and shortages related to the pandemic prompted many industries to reevaluate the resilience of their supply chains and consider additional sources of raw materials and workers. Apple, which recently announced that it expected sales to decline because of stoppages at its Chinese plants, is one of several tech companies that have shifted a small portion of their production to other countries, like Vietnam or India. The policy has also led to major global production constraints that are sustaining inflation. Global supply chain pressures increased moderately in October after 5 consecutive months of easing, largely due to increases in Asian delivery times. Much of the global inflation surge revolves around the manufacturing and production in China. With a halt in normal proceedings, it has posed some serious questions for industries. Talking about plunges, the situation in China has caused Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index to go down by 1.6%, and the Pan-European Stoxx 600 dropped down almost by 1%. The S&P 500 index in the US has also shown losses amid the economic situation in China. Markets across the globe are rattled, to say the least. After months of intense protests in China, a looming threat to its economy is just around the corner. But this threat is not just restricted to China, as other nations around the globe are also reliant on Chinese industry for its production and manufacturing. On one hand, we have the protests wreaking havoc inside Chinese industrial hubs, while on the other hand, there are some serious economic implications for China in the long run. To make things worse for the CCP, the tech giants are looking for alternatives for their gigantic industries. For example, Apple might consider India or Taiwan as a substitute for assembling centers. Investors are also sensing a shift in Beijing. Some of China's most successful private companies have come under great scrutiny as Mr. Xi's grip on power grows. Thousands of workers have lost their jobs, where 1 in 5 people aged 16 to 24 are unemployed. This is having some serious effects on the Chinese economy. The world is becoming used to the fact that Beijing may not be as open for business as it used to be, but Mr. Xi is risking the economic success that has powered China in recent decades. Although they might be able to shun the protests for a while, the draconian policies have affected the government's credibility, resulting in the biggest uprising in more than a decade. So what do you guys think about China's economic situation? Will the CCP fight back amid countrywide protests? Or will the Chinese economy suffer from an even worse effect in the long term? Let us know in the comments section below. Make sure you press the like and subscribe button, and we'll see you guys in the next video.